Hello everyone, this is Veiled Shadow talking about RWBY yet again. And yes, this is going to be a full series review. I think it's best if I start with some guidelines about how I'm going to be talking about Ice Queendom going forward. Since parts of the show are based on the original series, I will be making points of comparison between the two. I will also talk about it as its own story, separate from the original, and I will be breaking the videos down into 3 parts: story, characters, and animation. Story will be the episode's plot and how it ties into the larger narrative, if at all. I also want to talk about the characters, their personalities, and development as the series progresses. And of course, since this is an animated action series, I want to talk about how the animation is, especially for the fight scenes. Now, with that out of the way, let's actually get to the video. So, the name of the first episode is Red, White, Black, Yellow. Since this episode focuses on introducing the 4 leads, that makes sense. It also works out because this episode includes the events from the White and Black trailers. There are 3 main plot lines going on in the episode that, by the end, come together. 2 of the plots focus on Weiss and Blake, and the last one is split between Yang and RWBY. The episode also starts with a bit of narration instead of a opening. The short version is that in this world, humanity was almost wiped out by creatures of darkness called Grimm, and then they found some sort of crystal that could be used to defeat these creatures. It was named Dust because man is thought to have come from dusk and they would return to it when they die. So very fairy tale-esque and very cool, in keeping with the original's general motif and theme. The episode then begins with the first plot line, which is shared between Yang and RWBY. RWBY is at her mom's gravesite and is talking to her mom, or her headstone, about Yang getting accepted into Beacon and how RWBY is happy for Yang, but she also finds herself being jealous because she isn't great academically like her sister is, but she's just as good in a fight. Later, RWBY goes into town to buy a gift for Yang as a graduation present and ends up staying out too late. While Yang and her dad Tai are waiting for RWBY to get back home, Tai talks to Yang. He says that RWBY needs to learn to stand on her own without Yang. RWBY then ends up getting into a fight after the dust shop she is in gets robbed. She beats up the hired goons and chases after their leader, who escapes before she can catch him. She also gets saved by a huntress named Glinda. RWBY then gets taken to the police and is being yelled at by Glinda, who isn't a fan of RWBY's vigilantism. But Professor Ozpin, the head of Beacon Academy, shows up and talks with RWBY and lets her into Beacon, skipping 2 whole grades in the process. Yang is excited, and Ozpin mentions that RWBY has potential, and reminisces about Ty's old team called Team Stark. Now, you might be thinking, but where in all this do the other characters get introduced? Well, in between RWBY being at her mom's grave and her going into town, the other 2 plot lines happen. So the next part of the plot to be introduced is Weiss's plot, and we start with her at her family's home, where we get to meet several characters who are important to her. We have Klein, her family's butler, Whitley, Weiss's younger brother and general douchebag, Weiss's mom, who is a day drinker and alcoholic, her older sister Winter, and her dad. We see in this part of the episode that Weiss's dad wants Weiss to go through a test before she is allowed to attend Beacon. The test being to fight a Grimm that is a giant suit of armor. The fight goes well until Weiss gets hit so hard that she gets knocked flat on her ass. Her dad wants to call it there, but Winter says that she isn't done yet, and Weiss proves her right by getting back up. But then there's a cut to the last plotline of the episode, where we are introduced to Blake and Adam. The 2 of them are going to hijack a train and steal the dust on board. Adam notes that the train is guarded by robots because the humans are too scared to face them. They fight the bots for a bit, and then we cut back to Weiss. Instead of the fight with the Grimm being the first thing we cut back to, we instead get a scene where Weiss was beaten in a training session with Winter. Winter says that her aura can only take a hit or 2 before it goes down, and that the weak return to dust. I actually kind of like how they keep repeating this motif throughout the episode. Then we come back to the present day, and Weiss defeats the Grimm and her father grudgingly allows her to attend Beacon. Then, After that, we cut back to Adam and Blake, who take out the rest of the robots on the train, and Adam wants to destroy the train, and Blake points out that it has a human crew aboard. Adam doesn't care about that because they're not Faunus, and Blake decides she's had enough and disconnects the car with the dust from the rest of the train, saying that she needs to find her own path. A bunch of goons come up to Adam after that, and they ask if they should go after her. Adam says not to, as once Blake sees more of the world, she will realize that he is right. And then the next time we see Blake in this episode, she has applied and gotten accepted into Beacon. And for the last time, we cut over to Weiss, and she is leaving her family behind to go to Beacon. Klein is the only person there seeing her off, and while he tries to say that she could stay for just a little bit longer, Weiss points out why no one else is there. Winter is too busy, her dad and Whitley couldn't be bothered, her words, and she doesn't even mention her mom. But she was probably getting drunk at the time, so fair enough, I suppose. So she says her goodbye, and Klein says that she will be a great huntress and follow in the legacy of some guy named Nicholas, who I guess must have founded the Schnee family line based off of what Klein says. So goodbyes are said and everyone boards the transport to Beacon. There, a voiceover talks about how darkness can wipe out the light, and that the guardians of the world need to be vigilant, and that they cannot win through strength alone. Another voice says that victory is in the simple things that are long forgotten, and in a simple soul. And then the episode ends. Honestly, the plot here is just all set up. It sets up the girls' characters and how they got to Beacon, it sets the tone for the series going forward, it establishes concepts like the grim and dust, and it offers up questions that we will get answers to later on. Although I am not a fan of how they introduced some of these ideas. See, several things are mentioned in this episode that only make sense if you have seen the original show. Those things being semblances, aura, Atlas, the White Fang, and Faunus. To be fair, aura does get explained in a later episode, but I have to ask why it was brought up here with no explanation whatsoever. The original show didn't mention aura in episode 1. In fact, aura was not mentioned until episode 6, where they used John getting hurt as a way to segue into an explanation of aura. The Kingdom of Atlas being mentioned is also strange, as it wasn't mentioned until much later in the original, and here it would only make sense to a fan. Especially since Atlas gets brought up when Adam refers to the robots on the train as Atlas toys, which is a weird place for that line, considering that we haven't seen the robots yet in the episode when he says that line. And the White Fang and Faunus were mentioned in episode 1 of the original as well, but they were partially explained by a news broadcast, and they would later get a full explanation when they became antagonists. And Faunus would also be fully explained once the big reveal of Blake being a Faunus happens. One thing I find odd about this episode is what it covers from the original. As I've already stated, this episode covers the events of the black and white trailers as well as the entirety of the first episode. Having gone back and watched those again, I noticed that the writing for the first episode of the original is a lot more humorous than Ice Queendom. Some people might like that, but me personally, I'm not a fan. I enjoy RWBY when it's not taking itself too seriously. Now, we have quite a few characters that get introduced in this episode. We have, in no particular order, Ruby, Yang, Weiss, Blake, Adam, Ty, Winter, Whitley, Weiss's parents, Klein, Professor Ozpin, Roman Torchwick, Glinda, Cinder, Pyrrha, and John. And some of these are very loose when I use the word introduced. Some characters like Cinder, John, Pyrrha, and Weiss's mom don't get introduced either by name or by doing something on screen. They just kind of exist for a frame or two before we move on to something else, or the episode ends. Meanwhile, for the rest of the characters that we do get, we only get to know them a little bit. Ruby is shown to be a bit immature, impulsive, and prone to heroics, but she also doesn't take praise well from the way she acts around Yang when telling her that she made it into Beacon. Or maybe she just feels nervous about having skipped 2 grades. Honestly, there isn't any difference between the two versions of the character so far. Yang is shown to be compassionate and energetic, which is very in keeping with her party girl personality from the original. Weiss is cool, calm, and collected when things are going right, and is nice to people she knows while also having excellent manners. Again, not a whole lot changing there. Blake is calm and rather emotionalist, or at least not very expressive, but she does show that she cares about doing the right thing when she stops Adam from destroying the train and killing the people on board. So again, not a whole lot of change there, just kind of the same character we all know and love. Ty is just trying his best as a dad, as per usual. Osmond is the mysterious mentor figure, Glinda is a hard ass, but in Ice Queendom, they focus on that more than anything when it comes to her character. In the original, she tells Ruby that if it were up to her, Ruby would be sent home with a pat on the back and a slap on the wrist, which is a great line showing that Ruby tried her best and even Glinda thought she did well. But Ruby being there did also stop Glinda from pursuing Torchwick. In Ice Queendom, Glinda just yells at her and asks her if she could have stopped other people from being hurt in the process of stopping the goons in Torchwick, which just feels like a strange choice to not include something about Ruby having done well and just instead focusing on Glinda being kind of mean to her for no apparent reason. Meanwhile, Torchwick is the same over-the-top guy from the original, but slightly downplayed here and not quite as entertaining. Weiss's dad feels like a generic bad guy and Winter feels like a generic older sister. Whitley feels the same way, just a generic smarmy little shit. The rest of the characters I can't really talk about because they don't even make an appearance in this episode. I will say, though, that the character designs look as good as ever. Now, let's talk about my biggest complaint: the animation. So with a professional studio behind the project, you would think that this show would have absolutely amazing animation. That's a great thought, but no, the animation here is just okay. It's fluid and it looks gorgeous at times, but things begin to fall apart when it comes to the fight scenes. The battle between Weiss and the Grimm is alright, but there is one point very early on when she's attacking the thing in the face where I completely lose track of where she is. I doubt that was intentional, and it could just be that I blinked or something and missed where she was in the frame. There is also another point where she sets the Grimm's hand on fire and I guess it burns it away. Like, the Grimm loses its sword because of her using dust to damage its hand. The sword goes flying, and its hand is now on fire. Then I think it burns up while also roaring, then tries to punch her. It just seems odd when you could have just had the thing attack her instead of stand there for a few seconds, and you could have done a better job of showing the hand actually burning up, or being destroyed, or even just have it be cut off, and that be the reason why it drops its weapon. Also, she freezes the Grimm's legs so that it can't move, and when it goes to attack, she hops on its sword and rides it to get close to the Grimm to disarm it. But when she freezes it, the damn thing is only like a foot or two away, and its sword could hit her really easily before she tried to freeze it. Also, this Grimm is massive. It easily has the reach necessary to hit Weiss, and yet for some reason, it doesn't try it until Weiss freezes it solid. And the thing also stands at least a story tall and takes up most of the room. I don't know, the perspective for some of these shots just feels wrong. Like, the thing feels way too big for the space that it's in. Speaking of something feeling wrong, when Weiss beats the Grimm, she uses gravity dust to lift the thing in the air and then uses her glyphs to hold it in place. When she uses the glyphs, there are projectiles that launch and impale the Grimm, but in the next scene they turn back into glyphs with no apparent damage done to the Grimm. Meanwhile, in the white trailer, the projectiles hit and immediately turn into glyphs that keep it in place. So, points to the original. Also, when Weiss launches herself to deliver the final blow in Ice Queendom, for some reason she does a full 360 spin in mid-air before launching herself at the Grimm. And I gotta ask the question, why? What point does it serve to do that? It doesn't even look fantastic because there's no effect or anything on it. In the white trailer, she's winding up her attack by pulling her sword arm back before twisting her body to give greater force to the blow. Also, for some reason during the fight, she is constantly jumping and flipping, which sounds like a great idea to dodge attacks and everything, but the flips often serve no purpose aside from just moving her out of the way. And at one point very early on, she gets hit full force by the Grimm, but her aura seems to be intact, but after she gets punched in the face, her aura is down and she's bleeding. At least in the white trailer, when Weiss gets hit, it isn't until she gets decked in the face. In the original, the animation is consistent enough to not show her getting hit until that moment. At least in Ice Queendom, they remembered that blocking is a thing, and Weiss does block and parry the Grimm multiple times. But meanwhile, the fight on the train has some issues as well. First off, I have no idea why the robots in the first car activate. aside from they have to for the plot, or because we did it in the black trailer, so we gotta do it here too. And they seem to take a good second before they turn on, which means that there is an activation method to try and stop intruders, which is the whole point of the robots being there. I wouldn't mention this except for the fact that the black trailer has laser tripwires to show how the robots got activated in the first place. Then when Adam and Blake are on the roof of the train, Blake throws her gun sword at some of the robots and pulls on the ribbon tied around her wrist. Now, in the black trailer, this caused the gun to fire, and she had timed it so that the barrel was facing away from her, which would cause the thing to come back in her direction. From there, she can direct it by moving herself and her arm to try and hit people. Essentially, she uses physics to direct the thing, and the from a bullet to shift directions. So what happens when Blake does this in Ice Queendom? The fucking thing points itself at one of the robots like it has aim assist and shoots it dead, and then does the same for several other robots before it starts moving back towards Blake and landing in her hand. This thing defies the laws of physics and has aim hacks, apparently. Sure, okay, because that's how that works. And no, this is not me calling for realism in RWBY. This is me saying that in the original, I could see how characters were using momentum and basic physics to move around the battlefield and aid in combat styles. Meanwhile, in Ice Queendom, I'm constantly asking the question of, how on earth is this happening? And then we get to the last fight of the episode, which is between RWBY and the thugs. It's really short and does some of what I wanted it to do, mostly using actual physics and fight choreography that makes sense for the character. As an example, RWBY uses her scythe as a fulcrum to move herself around and uses the momentum of herself and the weapon to hit the bad guys as hard as possible. My biggest issue with this fight, though, is that it is a visual mess. Now, what I mean when I say visual mess is that the screen is very cluttered with effects. In this case, we have rose petals, RWBY's cloak kind of just all over the place, and speed lines on the characters where they're not really needed. The effect makes it hard for me to make out the fine details of the action, and it makes the whole thing feel rushed and off-putting. The best comparison I can make to, say, a real-life example would be a live-action movie with a really good fight scene that has really bad shaky cam, which ruins the fight. This, combined with constant perspective shifts, makes it difficult to understand where a character is in the environment and what direction they are moving in. So it makes RWBY's fighting style come off as less of a small girl using momentum and leverage to beat up full-grown men, and more like she has protagonist powers that allow her to win the fight. I mean, she is the protagonist, but that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make here is that the fight isn't interesting to look at, which is kind of bad considering that RWBY is an action anime. The other big issue here too is that there are several moments where it almost seems like they got the layering wrong on some of the shots. Like there's this one point where RWBY sticks her scythe into the ground, I guess to like slow her down or something, but instead of it looking like she actually put her scythe into the ground and started to tear up some of the ground around it, it just kind of looks like it's layered on top of the background, which is odd considering that this is 2D animation and not 3D animation. Another thing I want to point out about these fights is that the pacing for them is just awful. The Blake and Weiss fights both move too slowly. In the White trailer, Weiss is able to move fast enough that the quote-unquote camera loses track of her to show that she is moving too fast to see. And later in the series it is shown that Weiss uses speed to her advantage in combat. Meanwhile, Blake also uses speed to her advantage in the original show, but here she stands still and shoots with her pistol more than anything. The effect that this creates is that the fights are slower than they should be. These people are agile warriors in their physical prime, and they should move around a combat arena with ease. Instead, they seem to take their time before doing anything. Everyone is moving like they're underwater or encased in jello, not moving with the energy and speed of a life or death battle. And part of the reason why the fights feel so slow and low energy is because the music is also slow. The tracks that play for Weiss and Blake's scenes sound less like awesome ass-kicking music and more like battle music from a JRPG. That is to say that they are good and they do their job, but they don't really stand out. Meanwhile, the music that plays during RWBY's fight is better, but it just feels restrained. I keep thinking of how awesome the Black trailer was when From Shadows was playing in the background, and when the fight kicks off for real, the vocals come in to give it that extra kick. Or how in the White trailer it starts with Weiss singing, and when she fights the Grimm, it really jumps into high gear, including having far more bombastic lyrics. It's the little things that really elevate something beyond just being okay. And that's what this episode has been for me. Okay. Not great, not terrible, and I'm waiting to see if this gets better or worse. I hope they just put more effort in other places that we aren't seeing yet, but I doubt it. This is the first episode. This is where you're supposed to get people invested. You're supposed to wow people and make them go, oh my god, I can't wait to see what happens next. Which the original show did that by giving us a lot of questions that were slowly answered and then combined that with cool fight scenes and funny dialogue. But Ice Queendom has had all of the production and none of the heart in this episode. Well, those were my thoughts on the first episode of RWBY Ice Queendom, and I hope no one takes this too seriously. These are just kind of my thoughts on it, but nothing I've said here is really, I guess, set in stone. It's more just kind of incoherent rambling from someone who just wants a really good show and was instead just met with a really mediocre one. I get that it's only episode 1, and so it's a little early to judge things, but the early part of anything, whether it be a show, video game, movie, or book, is meant to make you so engaged that you come back for more. And I don't know, if I had to pay for this, because, spoiler alert, I'm not actually paying to watch any of this stuff, I would probably not come back, or at the very least, I wouldn't pay for a Crunchyroll subscription or a Rooster Teeth First subscription just so I could keep watching more of it. So, honestly, not impressed, hope it gets better, probably won't, we'll see what happens. And that's my take. So, if you liked the video, like, comment, subscribe, and I have more RWBY stuff on the way. And if you're not interested in RWBY content, just wait, I've got other stuff planned as well. And until next time, this has been Veiled Shadow. I'll see all of you later.